So this section we're talking about imaginary numbers, and this happens when we have the square root of a negative number. We call that an imaginary number, which is represented by I. So here's just some things you need to know. I is the square root of -1, and I squared equals -1. So what happens is we have the square root of a negative number. So if you tried to put this in your calculator, you would get something that's undefined. So in order to make it defined, or something we can work with, we use what we call imaginary numbers. So when you come across a radical with a negative under the square root, your first step is you take out an I, an imaginary number. So I'm going to use our multiplication properties that we learned in Unit 1. I'm going to make this the square root of -1 times the square root of +12. So I just separated this square root. And I did that because this, the square root of -1, is an imaginary number. We're going to call it I. And then we have the square root of 12. So now this is something we can work with because the square root of 12 is not undefined. So after you take out an I, step 2 is simplify the square root. And this is something you guys should be really good at by now. We've been doing it a lot. So I'm going to take factors of 12, 2 times 6, 6 is 2 times 3. And I'm going to rewrite this as 2 times 2 times 3. A pair of 2's I can take out. And then I will have 2i square root of 3. So this is the proper simplified way to rewrite the square root of -12. It includes an imaginary number and a simplified square root. Okay, so those are the first 4 problems on your self-check. I'm going to separate right here and go on to the next section and talk a little more about imaginary numbers. So sorry, this is a long section. So we're going to start with this. I equals the square root of -1. I squared is -1. And I could keep going. So if I was trying to find I to the third, I would take I squared times I. I would just separate the exponents. That's really I to the first. So I squared is -1. And then I is just I. We leave it in our answers. So -1 times I would be -I. So I cubed is equal to -I. I to the fourth, I'm going to rewrite as well using I squared times I squared. So I squared is -1. So -1 times -1 equals +1. And then this cycle just repeats. So if I take I to the fifth, I'm going to break it down using I to the fourth because that's 1. It's the simplest one to work with. So it'd be I to the fourth times I to the first, which would be 1 times I to the first is just I. So it'd be I. And we could keep going. I to the sixth, I would use I to the fourth times I squared, because I to the fourth is 1 and I squared is -1. So that would equal -1. So this pattern keeps going. I got I, and then I got I. And I got -1, and negative 1. If I took I to the 7th, I would get I to the 4th times I cubed. Well, I to the 4th is 1. I to the 3rd is negative I. So I get negative I, negative I. I to the 8th is I to the 4th times I to the 4th. 1 times 1 equals 1. So it's a repeating pattern. So let's say I want to simplify I to, trying to think of a number, the 33rd. My first step would be to start with a factor of 4. And then rewrite the exponent. So this is what this means. I'm going to rewrite I to the 33rd, and I'm going to go less than and take I to the 32, because 8 times 4 is 32. So I could break this into I to the 4th 8 times, but I don't want to. And then I'm just going to have 1 left over I. So I'm just rewriting it, because I to the 32 is equal to 1, and I to the 1st is just I. 1 times I is I. So I to the 33 is actually equal to just I. Okay, so there is one of those. It's the last question on your self-check.